We're broadcasting to the world. We've got a lot to get through today, so I may be rattling through slides at a fast pace, so try to keep going. So first, administrative issues. The wait lists, I think, are slowly clearing. Again, as I reminded you, they are in very many ways dependent on the departments under which you've signed up. So if you have questions, get in touch with those departments. If you happen to know someone who's decided they don't want to take the course, please persuade them to drop so that others can get in. That will be part of the backlog, is people just holding on to places who actually aren't going to take them. Blake has passed around a sheet of paper which will work its way around. Please, after you put your name on it, pass it on, just so we know who's here. Not so much so we can harass you, but so we can harass the people who aren't turning up but are holding places on the list. So please make sure that you're on it. If the piece of paper doesn't get you during the class, make sure you come up at the end and either tell Blake or get your name on the piece of paper, because that'll be important. This was the day of the first assignment, which I talked about a little. We got a lot in. A few points. Blake may have some more to add. The deadline is a drop deadline. If you make it, fine. If you don't, there's not much we can do about it. We broadcast the deadline. And in fact, BSpace just won't let you submit, probably. So please be cautious about that deadline. Forms of submission, a lot of people send attachments or put them in the Dropbox. I think, Blake, you would agree that your preferred method is?
Yes, so if you log in to find the assignment, and then you can upload it.
Yeah. So if you either write in or copy and paste your assignment into the assignment box, it allows us, in fact, to put comments in your direct assignment or refer to it directly rather than if it's attachment. So that's the preferred form, not obligatory, but my suggestion is do that as the quickest response. In terms of the content, a couple of things. One thing we tended to get from quite a lot of people was simply a summary. William said this, Heilbronner said that. But what we've actually asked you to do is really make an argument, to make a decision, not simply said who said what. So very briefly, ATQ, answer the question. Don't simply say my job is to summarize to prove that I've done this reading. What we want to see is what your opinion is about what those people are saying. So please make sure you do that. Cite. If you're going to refer to people, even to the people we're talking about, try to include citations. Because if you say William says, William's read an awful lot of things, so why not say he said it here, and preferably put a page number in. But in particular, if you're going to refer to anything outside the reading that we've assigned, do make sure that we can identify what that is and have an understanding of why you're citing it. Otherwise, we're just not sure what you're talking about some of the time. So cite, proofread. Some very nice arguments with some splendid errors in them. One reason I don't write on the blackboard much in class is I'm a wonderfully bad speller. So I have enormous sympathies, but there's a lot of different ways you can do spell checking. I worked with Jeff for a long while ago at a place called the Institute for Research on Learning, and the first publication that I put out from there referred to the Institute for Research on Leaning. So it's one of the triumphs of my past, but I would like you to avoid doing something similar to that. So please do proofread, check before you go. The slides are up, so you can grab them. Just one small point I'd like to add about the use of laptops in class. I was talking to a colleague over the weekend from UCLA who says she simply bans people from using laptops in class. Now that seems to me unreasonable. Neanderthal though I may seem, do acknowledge that we might be in the age of information. And I actually do think it's sort of unreasonable of the university to ask you to spend your life working on a computer and make you take exams writing in blue books. But the nature of access to Wikipedia and cheat notes unfortunately makes that necessary. So in class, for sure, take notes. If you want to follow along the slides, follow along. Two things to remember. One is that there's an awful lot of evidence that multitasking doesn't work very well. And that if someone is flashing you messages on your screen, it will be hard to follow what's going on around you because those messages are so tempting. That's your responsibility, but the second thing, do remember people around you. If you are dragging up images on your screen is constantly flashing, that may be fine for you, but it may be very distracting for people who are around you. So please bear that in mind too. And others, if you want to lean over to someone and say, please close that down, feel free to, because what we're here to do is in a sense discuss collectively rather than act as though we're the only person in the room. So please bear that in mind, just how you use your laptops in class. Okay, any questions about those issues? Yes?
For the assignments, I was looking at the recommendation things that you guys included. Do you care as much about the 200 word limit as you do about the arguments you actually make?
No, we care much more about the arguments. Okay, I mean, don't go on forever, because it's actually rather hard to find the argument that people make. On the other hand, don't believe that you can make a very convincing argument in something the length of a Twitter post. Okay, so somewhere in between a tweet and a PhD dissertation, but we're not wedded to counting the words. It's your argument that we really want to get a grasp on. Yes? They can be rough and broad. You don't have to cite in perfect MLA style or whatever. Just give so that you think pretty clear that we can identify what you're talking about. So you don't have to have the addition necessarily. Just give us a sense. Okay, sorry, let me, and I'll keep doing this. You are? Paulo? Okay, and you are? Alex, okay. I'll keep trying and I'll keep forgetting, but I'll do my best. Okay, two just sort of current events. Today is a significant day for this man. Why? State of the Union. And the State of the Union is in fact significant for us. Does anyone know why? Well, I think, and I'm not going to bet my life on it, but it's the only place in the Constitution that the word information is used. And the President actually has this obligation, he shall from time to time, it doesn't specify how, give to Congress information on the State of the Union. I mean, it's intriguing, you could hardly think of a major document being written now in which information is only written once. And in fact, it's a very intriguing time in the history of information when people, as I suggested last week with the Chesimard's Knox, start to become conscious of this notion of information, particularly in the political world, and how information has to move in some sense back and forth between the government and the governed. Tom Paine, who you will all I know, and I'm sure you can all put a date to when Common Sense was written, has this nice critique about the king and king royalty, and he says there's something exceedingly ridiculous that first excludes a man from the means of information and yet empowers him to act in cases where the highest judgment is required. Kings tended to be ill-informed, and yet they were the people to whom we turned to make decisions. So what we want, he's arguing, and there were societies created at the time called things like the Society for Constitutional Information in England. What we want is for this flow back and forth of what we would still now call information and ideas, so people have facts to argue with, to argue about. So in general, the term information, which will be reflected today in what goes on tonight in Congress, is coming up at this sort of time, what not called the age of information. And indeed, it's not simply Paine's idea that the governors need information. What they also need to do and have the obligation to do is to pass the information that they gather through their sources out to the people, this two-way expression or exchange of information. So there is, and in fact at this time, another word of enormous importance comes up in this context, and that's the word that we know more or less in a different world now, statistics. And of course, the root of statistics, comes in first from Germany, is indeed the root of the word state. And indeed, the first books of statistics in the English language were, in fact, the first one was really about Scotland, but was an account of the state of the nation, of the number of people, of the crops, of the industry, etc., etc. So what goes on tonight in some ways is a reflection of the enormous changes of which this country, as I was arguing, was one of the most significant interventions of the late 18th century. Okay, so where we're going today. We have been in the last couple of classes as we're talking about information, the history of information. Jeff was asking the question, what is information technology? And we wrestled with that a bit. And then I asked, what is an age? And how do we define those? So we're coming today to talk about this idea of determinism, which we brought up then, which has a couple of questions. One is, well, if we know what ages are, because we kind of think we do, are they shaped by technology, as Heilbronner seemed to be saying? And therefore, is this age shaped by EIT? Assuming, of course, that we know what an age is, and we know what technology is, and we know what information is. But yet we make these sort of questions, and they're important questions. I had those two images on the cover slide, hot in the news today as the Oscars list comes out. Can anyone say why those two movies might in some way be part of our discussion? Do you recognize the movies that they're from? Hugo, how many people have seen Hugo? All right, anybody willing to tell us roughly what the basis of the story is? No? Yes? Yes. You are? Sorry? Sophia? Okay, Sophia. Tell us. Mm-hmm. Okay, so one aspect of it is in fact to build this automaton. What people have done for years try to build machines that will be like human beings. And in some people they want to make them into information processors. So that's one aspect. But the boy has a relationship to another man in the movie apart from his father who has died. And what's the story of that man, played by Ben Kingsley? Yes. And you are, sorry? Alison. Yeah. Right, so Méliès is this old guy who dominated movies, and then something dramatic happened that he was no longer important. And part of the dramatic story is told later in the other movie. Anybody see the actor? Anybody seen the actor? Okay, well this is a movie, interesting to see, but which is about what happens when sound comes to the movies. And what happens as with, in Hugo, you get a new technology and boy, just the whole world changes. And in Hugo, it seems to me, Scorsese is trying to make the remarkable claim that people didn't dream until the movies came along. He has this extraordinary stuff in the beginning about how movies allowed us to dream and think. But in these two movies, I think, are examples just running in the back of the ground that says technology just changes humanity whether we want to, either on a personal level, which we can kind of understand, or on a broad social level, where suddenly the technology comes along and everything changes. So we don't want to overplay this, but yes? Well, and indeed, it's very much the same story, and indeed, yes, as with Al Jolson and movies like that. And of course, movies in particular love stories about technological determinism, because they wanted to say in many ways, and still do, Scorsese, I think, that movies come along and change the world, and boy, pay attention to movies, something that Williams discusses. Sorry, what was your name? Elisa. Okay, apologies, Elisa. I'll keep trying. Okay, so we're going to, those are what I'm trying to get here. These issues that are in the news, in the zeitgeist, people are thinking about them, they're written into the subtext of these movies in an interesting way, and they're ones that I want to take us through today, in particular with those reading in mind. So this is the ladder I'm going to try to climb today a little bit, just saying, well, what is this? Just going over the reading in part. Taking sides. What I asked you to do in the assignment is take sides, so we'll talk a little about the assignment, ask a couple of you if you would to speak up and say why you spoke for one side or the other, not turn it into a barroom brawl, but maybe a little bit of debate about who believes in what and what side. Looking at some of the older ideas, which we will come across in the course of this course, about claims that this new technology is going to change the world and nothing will ever be the same again, whether for better or for worse. And to say, well, how can we assess claims made today? And one advantage of a history course is we can go back and see when people made similar claims in the past, and how do those claims look to us now? And that might give us a way to think twice about some of the claims that are made today. So history, again, is going to be useful in that. Then, if I have time, and I will be moving fast, what are the attractions? Why do people like to argue this way? Heilbronner, in part, talked a little bit about that, about why it's a useful way to think, but also it's an attractive way to think. It makes certain kinds of thinking easy. Why should we worry about it? Why shouldn't we just let it be the way that people do think? Why is it something to be concerned about? And then, again, if I get there, I'll talk about some of the regular mistakes that turn up in looking at these determined arguments, and we can ask ourselves, as we go forward and look at different technologies as the course advances and changes that don't seem to have a technology attached to them, whether we can see evidence of these mistakes. So in some ways, we're setting up questions that will be coming up across the semester. Okay, so first, what is technological determinism? Fairly quickly, Heilbronner, both of these writers are Marxists of one form or another, and this is a particularly attractive form of argument to Marxism, but in fact we now find it more and more not with Marxists but with others. So Heilbronner in fact quotes Karl Marx, and he says the handmill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. So the social order of society is in some sense determined by these particular technologies. So we in some ways are therefore engaged with the question, well, what does the internet give you? Has the internet, whatever the internet may be, changed the social order in which we exist? Is the social order of the sort in which we talk about industrial capitalists or feudal lords, and as we look today at Mitt Romney's tax returns, does the social order look terribly different today? And in so what way? You're nodding in agreement. So you are? Emar. Okay, so you are.
I think it definitely has changed the social order in our society. I think more recently, even socially, our connection with the all around the world definitely changed.
Well, I agree with you there. I mean, our social connections have changed, and we'll talk about that in the course of the class. But does that change the nature of the social order? So, in a sense, thinking of that, I get your point, but think again of, Occupy Wall Street. Talking about the 1%. Does the notion of the 1% suggest that things have changed dramatically or that they haven't? For all our interconnections across the globe.
I think it makes movements like that come together like that easily. I don't think necessarily the 1% movement would be capable of happening.
Sorry, okay, my question is a slightly different one. Is the relationship of the 1% to the 99, which looks to me a little like the relationship between the industrial baron and industrial society in the 19th century. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, I mean, so I'm not to say not that any of the changes that you made are not significant, we'll get to those, but in the terms of Heilbronner arguing, I mean, again, the question is, has that notion of the social order, because in some ways the Occupy movement has brought attention back to this notion, and we're starting to see these accounts of, well, is social mobility in the United States actually now, heaven forbid, worse than it is in the United Kingdom? And that would be a pretty sorry story, and some people saying, yes, it is, it's harder to move across those barriers. Some other hands were up? Yes?
In some ways it kind of depends like on societal level, but you can also say like as much as the social order hasn't changed, there's no problem. But and that also makes it a lot easier to, in some ways, change your status quo, especially in localized areas, change your status quo. Now, like the journalists, for instance, with the advent of blogs and everything, you have in a sense of democratized journalism. And in that respect of society, you don't have the same classes where you say someone else can't report in the same way. As long as you get your fact rate right, well, then people accept it.
Okay, so maybe if I can log into this, because I think both of those are similar points and very important points, and we will talk about them, and we'll see people talking about them in the past. But just to keep a little distinct, so it's to be fair to Heilbronner in a way, because most of you voted against Heilbronner, is that he's talking about a fairly specific question, and that's the nature of the vertical social order. And to some extent, though, I think it's very important, what Imar might have been talking about is kind of horizontal relationships. And we have to ask the question, and I'm not saying how it should be answered at the moment, but whether changes in those horizontal relationships necessarily change the vertical relationship. I know you have some questions, but let me move on just because I can't stop too long, but we'll come back to some of these issues as we go along. Just in fairness to Marx, and in fact Heilbronner does clarify it a little, Marx's comment is embedded in a much larger question, where he in fact is talking about the social relations. And more to the point, and this I think some of you got out of Williams, what he says is social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. And there are two things there that Marx has a very complex notion of productive forces, but in a way this sounds to me a little closer to Williams when he says that they are closely bound up rather than simply determined. So the question is, does that closely bound up, is it what he's trying to say in this final comment which Heilbronner picks up? And we'll come back to that again. What Williams says then is what technological determinism is the claim that new technology is discovered by an essentially internal process of research which then sets up the conditions for social change. That's one, in fact, of the different arguments that he gives. But basically what you get is a technology, it goes out into the world, and society is changed by it. So society is determined by the technology. The rest, in some sense, is just history following from that. And history is then mapping that out. If you can go back and find the technology, you will know what happens after that technology lands in any particular society. I mean, that's one of the claims of technological determinism to bear in mind. Not simply that we can say, because the printing press or television came along, because the printing press came along in Northern Europe or television appeared in Northern America at a certain date, society was changed. But because technology is determinate, that means that if you take that technology and plunk it down anywhere else in the world, the same changes in theory should follow. That's what determinism at its core really means. And we need to think a bit about that. One of the questions that then gets left out, it seems to me, that Williams plays about with that question of intentionality is, well, how do changes between technologies happen? We now know how society changes, but if societal changes are driven by technology, then what is it that's driving changes in technology? How do you actually get from the hand mill to the steam mill? Now, this obviously is put back here, we are looking at feudal society, but as I'm trying to suggest, there are many modern versions of this. There is, for instance, arguments that we're all trying to make about new technology. And Zuckerberg is not alone in thinking that you can go out and design a technology and that technology will change the world. And the notion that the world will be changed by what we design is important, but the question is, what are the implications of that change? As has been mentioned already, many explanations, for instance, of the seasons of change, we're always coming around to another spring, but what was at first called the Arab Spring, was that it was social media. And you plonk those things down in those societies, and those societies will just collapse in front of that force. Now, as we look at Syria today, and as we look at places like Bahrain, there are serious questions about that point I made. Do we assume that this technology will then have the same effect in any society that it moves to? So something to bear in mind. So the general argument is made by Kevin Kelly, who is the senior guru at Wired. I think I've mentioned him, a tech journalist of long standing. And he says, look, this is basically the argument, that when technology shifts, it bends the culture. Culture in some ways is simply responsive to technology. So what we think of as culture is going to be hit by technology. Now, if you look at somebody like Kelly, and if you look at many of these arguments that get out, if you look at someone like Zuckerberg, the underlying assumption is this is going to be a good thing. Change technology, and the world will be a better place. For a long time, that's been debated. This is a famous quotation I think some of you will recognize. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us, we were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. Very famous passage, anyone recognize it? They shout out collectively because you all know it. Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Dickens will probably in this class, but also elsewhere in the world, be mentioned a lot this year. Anybody know why? He was born in 1812. 2012 is his 200th anniversary. You will probably be very tired of Dickens by the time that the season is over. But what he's saying, and this is about, what was he writing about in A Tale of Two Cities? What is he actually going on to talk about? We know the passage, what's the context? Some we've already discussed in class. The French Revolution, absolutely. So he's talking about revolution. He's talking about it a little later, looking back. Carlyle, who we've already mentioned, Dickens said, I'm going to write a book about the French Revolution, and Carlyle, who had written the history of it, said, I'll send you over a few books, and 2 cartloads apparently arrived outside Dickens' house, piled with books, but he managed to put those aside and write his own account. But what you get, and what you got at the time, and still get now in a way, is you can say, okay, this is a terribly dramatic change, lots of people will agree, but half will agree in saying it was a disaster, and half will agree and say it was absolutely tremendous. And again, that's an argument that we see around now, complete opposites in what they conclude, agreeing about the underlying theory that it's technology behind it. So for instance, with Kevin Kelly's Bending the Culture in recent books, John Battelle, who wrote about Google, and the title of the book is How Google, Its Rivals, Rewrote the Rules and Transformed Our Culture. So Google is now the technology that is changing everything. Or you get Andrew Keen, who comes along with The Cult of the Amateur and says how today's internet is killing our culture. So there again, he's bending the culture. So they are in some ways exactly the same underlying argument, but with a different evaluation of how it's made. And in fact, even in the news, anyone reading Slashdot yesterday would have seen that the Canadians were getting very worried about the internet destroying their culture. And that's something that's come up with almost every communications technology, whether it's television or movies, radio. Somebody, and particularly someone across a border somewhere, will say this stuff is going to destroy our cultural identity. And Canadians always terrified of being taken as, well, I won't go into that, I'll carry on. Okay, so in the all going direct to heaven argument, one thing people do then, of course, is like Dickens, is you look back at a particular event. But of course, once we've established that form of argument, we can look at a particular technology and say, boy, this is going to change the world. So, in fact, the colleagues of Jeff and mine from years ago wrote a paper called Letting Loose the Light, in which he argued forcefully that universal access, this is what the net is going to give us, to the world's written knowledge, and now we have a technology whereby any digital work could be made available for experiencing to anyone, anytime, anywhere in the world. It's the dream of universal access to